The man known to history as William the Conqueror was born at Falaise in the Normandy region of northern France in either 1027 or 1028. Like many other noblemen of the High Middle Ages, William's family did not use a surname, and since his byname, the Conqueror, was one which he acquired much later, we should consider him for the first 40 years of his life as simply William of Normandy. His father was Robert of Normandy, who in 1027, at around the time of William's birth, had ascended to the position of Duke of Normandy, ruler of the large Duchy of Normandy in northwest France, which dominated the valley of the River Seine as it flowed outwards from Paris into the English Channel. William's mother was a woman named Helena, whose precise background is unclear. One story has it that she was a servant of the ducal household at Falaise, others that she was the daughter of a tradesman from the town. Yet, although Helena's background is uncertain, there is no doubt that her liaison with Robert of Normandy was not within the confines of marriage or recognised by the church. Accordingly, William was not a legitimate child, and although he would succeed his father, he was, nevertheless, regularly referred to throughout his life as Bastardus, or the bastard, in reference to his illegitimacy. The Duchy of Normandy into which William was born, and which he would soon rule, was a relatively new dukedom or territory in France. Its origins lay in the early 10th century. William's great-great-great-grandfather was Harald Ragnar-Volson, a Viking who in the late 9th century led a large Viking contingent, which launched several raids into the north of the Kingdom of the Franks in what is now France. However, unlike many other Viking war parties, which simply raided regions and moved on, by the 870s, Harald and his Viking followers had settled in the lower Seine River Valley, from where they could exact money from Paris and farm the rich farmland of the Normandy region. This situation lasted until the early 10th century, when eventually the French king, Charles III, in 911, decided to accommodate Harald as one of his own subjects, rather than continue to be harassed by these Viking warriors. Thus, in 911, Harald became the first Count of Normandy, and he changed his name to that which he is most commonly known by today. He called himself Rollo, and in time, his ancestors would adopt the title of Dukes of Normandy. Thus, William was born into a Norse family, but one which had rapidly Gallicized. For instance, they adopted the languages and culture of their new homeland, speaking French and Latin, and employing laws which were partially Germanic and partially acquired from the civil law of the Romans as it was passed down to the Frankish kingdoms. However, they brought some of their own culture to the region as well. Consequently, this was soon understood to be a unique culture which was present in northwest France, one which would have an enormous impact on Europe during the High Middle Ages. They were called the Normans, and their culture was Norman culture. William's childhood is relatively shadowy compared with our extensive knowledge of his later life. He evidently received some sort of literary education, but the details are unclear, other than a nugget of information which reveals that a mysterious Ralph the Monk was involved. Easily, the most traumatic and momentous event in William's young life occurred in 1035, when he was either 7 or 8 years old. The boy would have been aware, even at this young age, of his father's prolonged absence from Falaise. In 1034, he had undertaken a pilgrimage to visit Jerusalem in the Holy Land. However, on the way home, he fell ill and died at Nicaea, in northwestern Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, on the 2nd of July, 1035. When news of his death reached Normandy, the young William, as Robert's only son, though illegitimate, was now proclaimed Duke of Normandy. William's reign during his minority was chaotic. Already during Robert's reign, there had been a number of overly powerful lords exercising too much independence from the ducal court at Falaise, and with an 8-year-old boy now the Duke of Normandy, these tendencies only became greater. Consequently, William's guardian spent much of the 1030s and early 1040s trying to re-establish ducal authority. The situation even declined to the extent that William had to be moved around the Normandy region for his safekeeping. Despite these early challenges, William was able to assume the rule of Normandy in his own right upon turning 15, most likely in 1042. Thereafter, in the years ahead, he succeeded in re-establishing ducal authority throughout northwest France, aided to a great extent by the King of France, Henry I, and in around 1047, William managed to see off a series of challenges to his legitimacy when his cousin, Guy of Brion, claimed the duchy for himself. Having eventually defeated Guy, William then cemented his control of the region by appointing his half-brother, Odo, as Bishop of Bayeux in 1049, a major position in western Normandy. It is also at this time that we first hear regular mention in contemporary histories of figures such as William Fitzosborne and Roger de Montgomery, as acting as William's advisors. These men would advise William for many years to come, and their appearance in the historical record at this time gives the impression that a stable and coherent government had been formed in the late 1040s. Thus, by mid-century, William had strengthened his control over Normandy and ended the instability which had characterized the region since the early 1030s. Having done so, William's thoughts turned to securing his line. In 1050, he married Matilda of Flanders, the daughter of Count Baudoin of Flanders. In what is now southern Belgium, Baudoin was one of the most powerful rulers in northern Europe at the time, and the marriage was a major diplomatic coup for William. In time, the union would result in 4 sons, Robert, Richard, William, and Henry, and his 5 daughters, Adelaida, Cecilia, Matilda, Constance, and Adela. 2 of these sons would sit on the throne of England in time to come. William's career subsequent to 1050, and the events which have made him one of the major figures in English history, must be assessed in light of developments in England as far back as the 1010s. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard, the King of Denmark and ruler of the Danes, a Norse people who had been raiding Britain extensively since the 980s, conquered England and usurped the throne from King Ethelred, the head of the Wessex line of kings, although Ethelred quickly fought back and resumed the kingship in 1014. He died in 1016, making his son, Edmund Ironside, the new king. However, Edmund was now cast into a new war with the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, Canute. By the end of 1016, Canute had managed to seize control of much of England from Edmund, and when the Wessex king died in November, Canute proclaimed himself king of all England, a powerful ruler who now reigned over a North Atlantic empire stretching from England east to Denmark and north to Norway. He would rule until 1035 and was remembered as Canute the Great. Despite Canute's ascendancy, the Wessex line was not wholly defeated. In 1016, Ethelred's other son and Edmund Ironside's brother, Edward, fled with the rest of the family across the English Channel. They found refuge at the court of the Dukes of Normandy, where they acted as kings of England in exile and were afforded many honours by William's grandfather and father in the 1020s and 1030s. Then, in the early 1040s, just as William was entering his early manhood and preparing to rule in his own right, the situation changed again in England. Canute was succeeded in 1035 by his son, Harald Harefoot, who subsequently died in 1040, only to be succeeded by another son of Canute's, Harthacnut. However, Harthacnut was a young man without an heir who was already suffering from some unspecified illness, possibly tuberculosis. Accordingly, in 1041, he made preparations for the succession should he die. His dispensation for England was that Edward, now known by the byname the Confessor, owing to his religious piety, would return from Normandy and succeed him as King of England, should he die without procuring an heir. This subsequently occurred the following year. Thus, the Wessex line of kings was restored in England in 1042. Edward did not quickly forget the support he had received from the Dukes of Normandy and the honours they had been afforded in northern France throughout his and his family's long exile in the quarter of a century after 1016. Although there is substantial controversy over these events, it is very possible that in 1051, when a crisis arose in England between Edward and the powerful Anglo-Danish house of Godwin, the king promised William of Normandy that he would succeed him as King of England following his death, Edward being without a legitimate heir and largely leading a celibate life. There is substantial reason to believe that this promise was actually made in 1051. Many of our most important sources for William's life attest to it. For instance, the Gesta Wilhelmi, or Deeds of William, written by William of Poitiers around 1066, and the Gesta Normannorum Ducum, or Deeds of the Dukes of the Normans, compiled by William of Jumièges around 1070. Both include this version of events. However, these could be dismissed as having been written after William had made his claim to the throne of England and conquered the country, and as such, might be deemed politically biased. But there is also evidence from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a long history of England in the Middle Ages, which predates William becoming king. Recent studies have proven that the relevant sections of the Chronicle detailing Edward's promise to William were written in the 1050s or early 1060s, before William became King of England. Consequently, the author would have had no political reason to include this version of events if it was not true. There is then every reason to believe that Edward did in fact make William his heir in 1051, and that the Norman Duke's claim to the throne of England was authentic and strong as a result. Whatever the truth of these matters, their material significance for William would not become a concern for another 15 years, as Edward lived well into the 1060s. In the interim, William faced further challenges at home in Normandy. Despite his earlier alliance with Henry I of France, William clashed with the French monarch on several occasions in the 1050s, a result of the splintered and decentralized power arrangement which predominated in France throughout the 11th century. Several invasions of Normandy were undertaken by Henry between 1053 and 1057, but when William won a substantial victory against the king and his allies at the Battle of Varaville in August 1057, the tide was turned. William now went on the offensive against Henry, and when both the king and his foremost ally, Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, both died in 1060, William was able to impose his power throughout northern France. In 1063, he even managed to bring the entire county of Maine, a substantial French province in the south of Normandy, under Norman rule. This brought extensive additional resources under William's control, which would aid greatly in his invasion of England a few years later. Having secured the southern border of Normandy, William turned his attention west in 1064 towards the Celtic Duchy of Brittany and its ruler, Conan II. This resulted in the Breton-Norman War, which would last until 1066, eventually ending in something of a stalemate. But it is curious for having involved Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex in England, and the head of the powerful House of Godwin. Harold had most likely been sent to France to reaffirm King Edward's earlier offer to William to succeed him as England's ruler. At this time, William made Harold swear an oath that he would accept his succession. This latter event is vividly depicted on the Bayeux tapestry, a 70-meter long cloth tapestry produced in the 1070s and which still survives today. It depicts the events leading up to William's claim to the throne and his subsequent invasion of England in 1066, housed today in the Bayeux Tapestry Museum in the town of Bayeux in Normandy in northern France. It is a remarkable survival and a striking record of William's ascent to the kingship of England, or at least how we wish people to understand how he had risen to the kingship. The meeting of William and Harold in northern France in the mid-1060s was to take on a striking significance in early 1066. King Edward the Confessor, by now in his 60s, fell into a coma late in 1065. He never fully recovered, and he died on the 5th of January, 1066, in London. He still had no clear heir, and Edward's lack of clarity and indecision over the succession now opened a window of opportunity for Harold. The following day, on the 6th of January, the Anglo-Saxon Witan, the assembly of Anglo-Saxon and Danish lords and members of the ruling class of England, met and proclaimed Harold as the new King of England. The stage was set for a major showdown with William. Within weeks, plans were underway in Normandy for William to enforce his claim as Edward's successor. Indeed, it is almost certain that William had been preparing politically and militarily for Edward's death throughout the 1060s. Hundreds of warships and transport boats were now gathered or placed under construction in the ports of northern France, and William reached out to his recently acquired subjects and allies from across northern France to aid him in his invasion. William was not the only claimant to the throne. Harold also faced challenge from his own brother, the Earl of Northumberland, Tostig. As the Earl of a large domain in northern England and a member of the powerful House of Godwin, Tostig had his own considerable support to claim the throne. He had already been implicated in a rebellion in the north in 1065, prior to Edward's last illness and death. Now in 1066, he clashed directly with Harold, who banished him from England. Tostig spent the spring and summer months scheming with various foreign powers in the world of the North Atlantic. He took refuge with his brother-in-law, the Count of Flanders, Baldwin V, who gave him the financial and military support to raid southern England in the summer. Tostig even considered allying with William, but eventually he looked further east to Norway, and at some point in the summer of 1066, he made contact with King Harald Hardrada of Norway and convinced the Norse monarch to lay his own claim to the English throne. Harald Hardrada received Tostig's petition favourably. He quickly prepared an invasion force of approximately 10,000 men and 300 ships, which landed in northern England in the early autumn. Initially, Hardrada and Tostig made good progress. A substantial victory was won against some regional forces outside the town of York at Fulford on the 20th of September 1066. But in the days that followed, Harald arrived in the north himself with his armies. The forces of the English King Harald and the Norwegian King Harald met at the village of Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire on the 25th of September 1066. The result was a stunning victory for the English Harald. Both Hardrada and Tostig were killed in the engagement, and thousands of Norwegians were killed or badly wounded. Such was the scale of their defeat that of the 300 ships which had conveyed the Norse army to England, only 2 or 3 dozen were needed to bring what was left of the army back to Norway. Harald had seen off the first major threat to his rule, but the greater one waited to the south, and the distraction created by the northern invasion of Hardrada was not insignificant in the campaign which followed. Having spent the summer rallying his allies and supporters in France, William's invasion force of perhaps somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 men crossed the English Channel on the night of the 27th of September, making their full landing near Pevensey in East Sussex on the morning of the 28th. The date is significant, as Harald had been making preparations in the south throughout the summer and early autumn against William's landing, but the invasion by Hardrada and Tostig in the north had drawn his forces away, allowing for a smoother landing in the south. Thus, the stage was set for the final showdown between Harald and William. Having disembarked, William moved his forces to the nearby town of Hastings in late September and early October, and in the process, his forces devastated the surrounding Sussex countryside, requisitioning food supplies for the army, and also as a form of psychological warfare. But no sooner had he defeated Hardrada in the north than Harald had to quickly make his way south to see off the second invasion. On the other hand, William did not advance north towards London and Harald's forces. He was content to wait. His reasons were twofold. First, he had established a strong base with good supplies collected from the surrounding region. Secondly, he did not wish to sever his lines of communication with his fleet by advancing inland. Clearly, William was preparing for the possibility of an unsuccessful military engagement against Harald, and the eventuality that he might have to make a hasty retreat back across the Channel to Normandy. By the 13th of October, Harald had advanced south to near William's position at Hastings, when William received word of the king's arrival in East Sussex and his encampment to the northeast of the town. He prepared his troops and marched out from Hastings at shortly after dawn on the morning of the 14th. The ensuing battle, one of the most critical in English history, has become known as the Battle of Hastings, but it did not actually take place in or next to the town of Hastings itself. Rather, the clash occurred roughly 11 kilometres to the northwest of the town, near a steep ridge in the Sussex countryside. The area is now the site of the village of Battle, named in honour of the conflict which occurred there nearly a millennium ago. The exact specifics of how the battle played out are a matter of some dispute, not least because contemporary histories and accounts tended to greatly distort events for political reasons in the aftermath. For instance, the number of troops involved are usually exaggerated to a great extent. Nevertheless, historians today are agreed on the general facts of the battle. William brought at least 7,000 men with him out of Hastings, and perhaps as many as 10,000, a large proportion being Norman heavy cavalry, the elite warriors of 11th century Europe. Harald had a similar number, but these were tired after the month of exertion in marching all the way north to Yorkshire and then returning quickly to the south, fighting the Battle of Stamford Bridge along the way. The battle commenced in the early morning at Battle and lasted all day, a long engagement for the time. Harald's forces had the advantage of the high ground, having occupied the high ridge at the site, but they were restricted by having the Forest of the Weald at their back. Thus, while William's forces were disadvantaged by having to move uphill, they had greater room to move about the battlefield. In the end, 3 factors won the day. William was able to deploy his archers to pick off Harald's troops on the ridge. Secondly, his cavalry was superior to Harald's, but the most significant factor was William's generalship. Throughout the day, he used a number of feigned or pretend retreats to disrupt the English lines, and strike at the weak points in Harald's arrayed men. It was during one of these feigned retreats, late in the day, that Harald himself was struck down and killed. With the king dead, the Anglo-Saxon and Danish forces broke, many fled, and others surrendered. Thus, by the time the sun set on the 14th of October, 1066, over the field of battle, and near the town of Hastings, Harold Godwinson was dead, and William of Normandy was one gigantic step closer to claiming the English throne. From a military perspective, Hastings was not just the critical battle in the war for the throne of England in 1066, it also reflected the changing order in the North Atlantic world, as for nearly 300 years, the world of Scandinavia, Britain, northern France, and the Low Countries had been dominated by the military power of the Viking people, who burst out of Europe in the late 8th century. With their longboats and their infantry warriors, Hastings marked the triumph of Franco-Norman fighting tactics with its mixed infantry and cavalry over the Anglo-Saxon and Danish troops, which had long dominated the North Atlantic world. In the aftermath of the battle, William did not immediately assume the English crown. This was complicated by the creation of a new king by the Lords of the Witan in London. The man chosen was Edgar Atheling, a grandnephew of King Edward the Confessor, and the grandson of King Edmund Ironside, who had briefly ruled England 50 years earlier in 1016. When news of Harold's defeat and death at Hastings reached London in the days that followed, a decision was taken to proclaim Edgar, a boy of perhaps 13 years of age at the time, as the king. Edgar's reign would be one of the shortest in English history. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Hastings, William proceeded cautiously, securing the towns of Dover, Canterbury, and Winchester before making any attempts to seize London. By this means, he secured the South and the Midlands and isolated the supporters of the puppet king in the capital. Just weeks later, as William's armies advanced towards London, the supporters of the young king made the decision not to continue the charade of pretending William could be resisted. The boy king and his supporters met with William not far from the capital in early December. Here, an agreement was reached which allowed Edgar to abdicate peacefully. This action and the seizure of London completed the initial Norman conquest. William of Normandy was crowned as King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066, and it is from this date that he ceases to be known as William of Normandy, but as William I, or, as he is more commonly known to history, William the Conqueror. It would be incorrect to suggest that the shift which occurred in England in 1066 was limited to a few set-piece battles and a change of ruler, after which things settled down again quite quickly. England had been conquered by a foreign power, one which brought with it new ways of governing, laws, cultural mores, and even a different language. As we will see, over the next 20 years of his life, William and his Norman followers would transform England from a hybrid Anglo-Saxon and Danish land into a new Anglo-Norman kingdom. As one of the great historians of medieval England, Richard Southern, once noted, no country in Europe, between the rise of the barbarian kingdoms in the 5th century and the 20th century, has undergone so radical a change in so short a time as England experienced after 1066. Some of these changes were immediate. The changing order saw thousands of Anglo-Saxons and Danes who had been strong supporters of the House of Wessex or the Danish lords flee England, either for Denmark, Norway, Scotland, or even neighbouring Ireland. Many would attempt to organise new invasions to restore the old rule of the Anglo-Saxons and Danes, but most would never return. In their place, William brought in thousands of Norman settlers from France, perhaps as many as 20,000. These medieval colonists did not enormously dilute the existing population, but they did place a strong body of Normans in positions of power in many of the towns and villages up and down 11th century England. Over time, these newcomers transformed English society. The most obvious and enduring sign of this was the introduction of the language of the conquerors, Anglo-Norman, a dialect of Old French with some traces of Norse in it, reflecting the Viking heritage of the Normans. Over time, much of the diction of the Anglo-Norman was absorbed into English, thus fundamentally altering the language spoken in England into a hybrid of Germanic and Romance languages. This would take centuries to fully occur, however, and for the remainder of William's reign, the conquering class spoke a version of French, and the bulk of the population still spoke Old English. Thus, bilingualism would have become necessary for many working in government or as traders in London and the other towns from the late 1060s onwards. Along with this lingual change, shifts in the functioning of government and the law also occurred. Law French became the language of the courts, a position it would hold legally until the 18th century. Moreover, the court system now became more centralized under Norman rule, a move which helped in the development of the common law in the 2 centuries that followed. A truly positive development was the gradual phasing out of slavery as a regular feature of society in England, this being far less common practice within Norman society. Another very substantial change William brought about was his reform of the English Church. At the time of the Conquest, the Church in England was very loosely organised. William tied it much more closely together and appointed several followers to senior positions in order to impose uniformity. Lanfranc, a celibate Benedictine monk, was made Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070, the same year that William's chaplain, William of Bayeux, was made the Archbishop of York. Between them, the pair oversaw the creation of a centralised Anglican church, which strove to maintain its independence from the papacy in Rome on many matters, an independent streak of Anglicanism which foreshadowed many developments in the English church in years to come. But the real heart of the changes wrought throughout England in the aftermath of the Norman conquest lay in the sphere of land ownership. William had many followers who had supported him, not just in his campaign against Harald in 1066, but throughout several periods when he needed their military and political support in the 1040s and 1050s. England was now their bounty. We can gain an insight into just how great this land transfer was from the Domesday Book, a record which William commissioned nearly 20 years later in the winter of 1085. Finished in 1086, it comprises a vast survey of land ownership in 11th century England. 2 decades after the Norman conquest, this was the most extensive account of land ownership produced for the country until the 19th century, and what it reveals is the manner in which William rewarded his French and Norman followers in the aftermath of his conquest by granting them vast territories throughout the country. Leading lords and followers had enormous estates bestowed upon them. These were often huge chunks of land in geographically strategic regions, which they were also expected to control in the interest of the Normans, as the conquerors of this foreign land. For instance, one of William's strongest supporters, Robert de Beaumont, heir to the title of Count of Merlon, in Normandy, had fought with William at Hastings. He was rewarded with over 90 manors in England in the years that followed, strategically centred around Warwickshire and Leicestershire. Thus, this leading companion of William's was to hold the English Midlands for the Norman interest, and was given enormous estates in the region to do so. On these in the years ahead, the new Norman stone castles would have begun to appear throughout the countryside as a means of securing Norman rule here if the Anglo-Saxons and Danes should rise up. In recognition of his immense authority in the area, Robert was made the first Earl of Leicester later in his life. He was not alone in being placed in a position like this. Another senior companion of William's in 1066, William de Warenne, was granted land in at least 13 counties by the 1080s, particularly around Sussex and Surrey. He was ennobled shortly before his death in 1088 as the first Earl of Surrey. William Fitzosborne, the Lord of Breteuil in Normandy, was a close companion of William's, who was also related to the Conqueror. He was given a position of prominence in the West Midlands and March region bordering into Wales, particularly the counties of Herefordshire, Gloucestershire and Monmouthshire. Here he was given Clifford Castle, Berkeley Castle and Monmouth Castle as imposing symbols of Norman rule. He was also quickly made Earl of Hereford to symbolise his preeminent position in the English West Midlands. Through these measures, William and his Norman companions imposed their rule over England in the years following the conquest. This was not a benign conquest. Enormous land transfers of this kind severely uprooted people and turned England upside down. Moreover, the conquest itself in late 1066 caused severe devastation of the countryside of southern England. It was not long before it provoked resistance. In 1067, William had returned to France to oversee his domains there. Unrest began rising as soon as he left for France. When he returned later that year, an extensive programme of castle building had already been undertaken by William Fitzosborne to try and impose greater control over the regions beyond London and the home counties. And early in 1068, William campaigned into the West Country, where Norman rule was being resisted. The following year saw perhaps the greatest threat to the newly established Anglo-Norman kingdom. A major rebellion broke out in Northumberland in 1069, which coalesced around the figure of Edward Etheling, the House of Wessex member, who had briefly been proclaimed king in London in the winter of 1066. The rebels here were also aided by contingents of Danes from Scandinavia, but all were driven south into Scotland when William campaigned against them in 1069. This was a brutal military action, with William devastating the countryside of northern England. A near-contemporary chronicler, Orderic Vitalis, who is generally regarded as an accurate chronicler who did not sympathise with the Norman conquerors, described William as bringing famine and the sword to northern England in 1069. His description is corroborated by the evidence of the Domesday Book, which showed that land values here in the north of England were still enormously lower in the 1080s than they otherwise should have been, a sign of how much damage William and his followers inflicted on the region to suppress its independence. Further campaigns followed in 1070 in the northwest along the coastline near Chester and the March region bordering Wales. New castles were quickly erected and Norman overlords imposed their will. The last major pockets of resistance were not finally crushed until 1071. Thus, we might consider that far from being a short military conquest in 1066, the Norman conquest was actually a long 6-year campaign in which England was subjugated by the Normans through a brutal strategy of military conquest, enforced famine, and the replacement of the Anglo-Saxon and Danish aristocracy with a new nobility of Norman knights, ruling the country from their imposing stone castles. Hand in hand with this brutal policy of military subjugation, William also implemented a propaganda campaign in the late 1060s and 1070s to justify his invasion of England and the benefits of Norman rule. We have already seen that writers such as William of Poitiers and William of Jumièges were writing soon after the conquest in ways which depicted William's career leading up to 1066 and the actions of that year in a favourable light. Other efforts were more visual and symbolic. The Pope in Rome, Alexander II, ordered in 1070 that William and his followers should do penance for the sins they committed in killing many people during the conquest, and in the months and years after, William took this as an opportunity to further glorify the conquest. The penance he undertook was to order the construction of an abbey for the religious order of the Benedictines. It was to be built on the battlefield in the northeast of Hastings, where William had effectively won the throne of England in October 1066. The altar of the church within the abbey was apparently placed at the exact location where Harald had fallen during the battle. Dedicated to St. Martin, Battle Abbey was only completed after William's death, but is a striking example of Norman propaganda in England. More famous is the Bayeux tapestry previously mentioned. Its exact origins are not entirely clear, but it is assumed that this was commissioned either by William's wife, Matilda, or his half-brother, Odo, Earl of Kent and Bishop of Bayeux. The latter theory seems more likely, and if so, it was very likely that Odo had commissioned it to be placed in the newly built Bayeux Cathedral when it was consecrated in July 1077. Yet, even if Odo did commission it, it is highly unlikely that William was not aware of the project or had not granted it his seal of approval, because as a visual display of the official history of the Norman conquest standing in Bayeux Cathedral from 1077, the tapestry would have told William's subjects in Normandy the story he wished them to believe about how he had come to be King of England. In the aftermath of his final conquest of the country, William made clear his priorities in terms of his domains. They lay in France, and for the remainder of his life, some 15 years, he would spend approximately 4/5 of all of his time in Normandy and elsewhere on the continent, only returning to England for short periods of time. Our natural inclination is to think that William would have made England his home in the 1070s, is based on our knowledge of England's later position as a great world power, but in the world of 11th century Europe, the real heart of William's territories lay in France, closer to the central of Norman and French culture, which was gradually spreading out to conquer many other parts of Europe, notably much of southern Italy and Sicily. He was also needed in France. Unrest arose there in the mid-1070s and forced him into several years of military campaigning, firstly to resume control of the county of Maine in 1073, following a revolt which had broken out there during his absence in England, and then to campaign against the French, whose power was being restored under the new monarch, Philippe I. But the most pressing issue was a family dispute which arose between 1077 and 1080 between William and his eldest son and designated heir, Robert. William had left Robert in charge of Normandy when he had left for England in 1066, and the dispute might well have arisen as a result of disappointed hopes held by Robert that he would effectively rule the French duchy thereafter. with William living in and contenting himself with his new English domains. The conflict, though settled by 1080, foreshadowed rivalries that were to bedevil the family for years to come. War with Scotland in 1079 brought William back to England for an extended period of time in 1080 and 1081. No doubt the resulting military campaigns throughout Northumberland served to further destabilise a region which had already suffered greatly under Norman rule. It was also during this time that he travelled deep into Wales, firstly on a pilgrimage to St David's in the extreme west of the country, but also as a means of imposing some sort of overlordship over the Welsh princes there, the first in a longer and intermittent process whereby English rule was established in Wales during the late Middle Ages. The final years of William's reign were in many ways an anticlimax after the heights of achievement seen in the 1060s, when the Normans had united so much of Britain and France under the rule of one man. A further conflict arose with Robert in 1084, which led to his exile from Norman court. He would not return during William's lifetime. The mid-1080s also saw an emergency arise within England over an expected invasion of the country by a joint force of Danes and Flemish troops under the King of Denmark, Canute IV, who sought to challenge William for control of the country. Demonstrating the callousness of the Normans towards their English subjects, the new lords of the country implemented a policy of scorched earth throughout eastern England in preparation for the invasion, the idea being to deprive any army which landed of crops and other supplies to sustain themselves, in the event the invasion never materialised, as Canute died in Denmark before it ever departed. But the Domesday Book attests to the manner in which East England was devastated by the Normans, who prized the military benefit of doing so over the damage it did to the communities who lived there. William spent Christmas 1085 at Gloucester, and it was while he was there that the Domesday Book was commissioned, more often called the Winchester Roll in its own day. As a result of being housed at Winchester, it gradually became known as the Domesday Book from the late 12th century onwards, the reference being to Doomsday in the sense of the finality it offered in its records of landholding in Anglo-Norman England. Portions of the text were brought to William while he toured some of southern England in 1086, but he would never have seen the finalised text in the format in which it survives today at the National Archives of the United Kingdom at Kew in London, as it was not fully finished and collected together until after his death. It is fitting that one of the final acts of William's reign was to order its completion. The Domesday Book presented a striking picture of how the Norman conquest had transformed England, and of the 1,400 or so Anglo-Saxon and Danish tenants-in-chief who had formed the upper caste of landholders in England prior to 1066. Only two were still in place in 1086, when the Domesday Book was compiled. Several thousand freemen and freewomen below these tenants-in-chief still held lands which their families had possessed prior to the conquest, but these now owed service and taxes in kind and cash to their new Norman overlords, those who had been placed throughout England, who lived in the many stone castles which had been built in the 20 years since William of Normandy had become William I of England. William left England for the last time in the autumn of 1086. He returned to France, where his enemies on that side of the Channel, including the King of France, had yet again taken advantage of his absence in England to begin attacking his possessions in Normandy and elsewhere. In 1087, he stabilised the situation and then campaigned towards Paris. It would be his last military action in a life, which consisted for nearly 50 years of warfare. In July, while undertaking a siege of the town of Mantes in the northwest of Paris, he became ill, possibly having suffered a riding accident which caused the pommel of his saddle to rip into his stomach. As a result of the injury, he was moved back north to Normandy, first to the town of Rouen and then to the Abbey of St Gervais, outside the town. It was here, on the 9th of September 1087, at about 60 years of age, that the Conqueror of England, the Norman who had united much of France and England under one ruler, finally died. In the days that followed, William's body was transported to Caen, where it was laid to rest in a tomb in the Abbey of Saint Etienne. The succession was a more complicated matter. As early as 1063, William had designated his eldest son, Robert, as his successor as Duke of Normandy. However, the matter of the succession to the throne of England had never been fully resolved, and the falling out between William and Robert had suggested that Robert would not succeed him. Moreover, it was common practice amongst the Normans for multiple sons to split the inheritance from their father, but as the second son, Richard, had predeceased William and died in 1081. The next eldest was William, called William Rufus for his red beard. The arrangement now reached was that Robert would succeed to the Duchy of Normandy as agreed in 1063, but William would succeed his father as King William II of England. The fourth son, Henry, was given very little, though he would eventually succeed William II as King of England many years later in 1100. As perhaps befitted William the Conqueror's life and the bloodshed which followed him, his sons would spend many years after 1087 at war with each other for power in the political world of northern France and England, and when Henry himself died in 1135, England was yet again thrown into civil war. Thus, for all that the Conqueror did to transform England after 1066, his family could never peacefully rule the country for very long. There is no doubting that William of Normandy, who became William the Conqueror, was one of the most significant figures in English history and one of the most consequential rulers of medieval Europe, having assumed the rule of a relatively unstable duchy in northern France when he was just 7 or 8 years old. He succeeded in his young adult years in not only securing his position in Normandy, but in also browbeating the King of France and effectively conquering the county of Maine in the late 1050s and early 1060s. And at the peak of his powers in France, he began in 1064 to campaign west into the Duchy of Brittany. It was at this point, when his military and political power on the continent was at the strongest it would perhaps ever be in his lifetime, that Edward the Confessor died in England without an heir. The result was a military invasion in 1066, the Battle of Hastings that October, and William's coronation as King of England on Christmas Day. But the real conquest took 6 years and was a bloody, brutal affair which would have unleashed misery on many people living in England at the time. In its aftermath, William and his followers transformed England totally in the case of landholding, and gradually in the case of its culture, with the adoption of new laws and customs, and eventually the creation of a new language in modern English which blends the pre-conquest Germanic language of the Anglo-Saxons and the post-conquest French of the Normans. By temperament, William was, by all accounts, an easygoing character. He was clearly religious and founded many churches, though he had limited appreciation for the supposedly universal sovereignty of the Pope in Rome, and his governance of the church within his own dominions preempted that which Henry VIII would later attempt by nearly 500 years. He was, it appears, faithful to his wife Matilda during their long marriage, an unusual occurrence for the time. Nevertheless, he was a largely uncultured figure, one who hardly patronized the world of learning in England or France, and who pursued his political and military ambitions with a dogged single-mindedness born of a strong character. It was this single-mindedness which brought the Normans to England and transformed the country forever. What do you think of William the Conqueror? Was he a great king who united England after many years of unstable kingship, or was he an ambitious tyrant who brutalized England in his efforts to reduce it to Norman rule? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Hello guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy our work and would like to support the channel, please visit our revamped Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee membership pages, which contain rewards, such as early access to our content, merchandise discounts, and audio versions of our videos, along with much more that we give to our valued supporters. If you have not yet signed up to help our cause, we'd like to ask you to please consider doing so, as we need to secure the channel by safeguarding it from possible demonetization, and also invest in better equipment, software, and more people to help us improve our videos going forward. In short, without your contributions, these videos would not be possible. So if you would like to ensure this channel never has to shut down due to demonetization, please spare whatever you can per month and become People Profiles patrons. Thanks for listening.